right, so part 2. So we got to go to another part of scripture that is used to show that we can eat the foods that were deemed unclean, abominable, and abomination. So remember in Deuteronomy 18, the foods are described as abominable. And also, again, in Leviticus 11, we get another rundown of it. But also in Leviticus 18, remember, the sexual sins are also called abominations and abominable. And it's the same word, toabah. So Yah is telling us that those things are abomination, toabah, sick and disgusting to him, repulsive. And they are not to be done by his people. So, again, if we're going to say the toabah, sick and disgusting foods are good, we have to go to Leviticus 18 and say, oh, those sexual sins that are toabah are good too. But we're not going to do that, are we? So something is off. And that is because we have been taught wrong about foods. So they were toabah then and they're toabah now. And so we're going to go to Matthew 15, the scripture about the dirty hands. But again, everything is context. You got to read that whole chapter. People, you can't just take one verse out of context and make a doctrine out of it. You got to take verse 20 and then you got to go through the whole chapter and see what it's really talking about. So starting at the beginning, it says, Then came to Yahusha scribes and Pharisees which were of Jerusalem, saying, Why does your Talmudim transgress the tradition of the elders, for they wash not their hands when they eat bread? So the disciples were eating without washing their hands, of course being observed, and they were being called out here. But this was a tradition of man. But he, Yahusha, answered and said unto them, Why do you also transgress the commandments of Yahweh by your traditions? So they were calling him and his disciples out for violating what was a tradition of man. And we know that they were hypocrites, right? So he throws it back on them and saying, why do you transgress what you really ought to be doing? The commandments of Yahweh, the Torah. So we all know that they held up the traditions of man above the holy word, the Torah. So going down to verse 18, after that whole exchange, it said, Yahusha says, But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. And he's speaking, of course, making a teaching, telling his disciples, but this is directly to those scribes and Pharisees. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, blasphemies. For they were doing all these things. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands defiles not a man. And of course, who is he talking directly to? What we read in the first 3 verses of the chapter 15. So first he rebuked them, and then he rebutted what they were trying to convict them of. And so we see that verse is not saying that we can eat anything and anything is clean for us to eat, because it was a direct rebuttal to the Pharisees and scribes in the first part of that chapter. Okay, and then we know Jesus didn't do away with the Torah, as he said in in chapter 5. So the word doesn't contradict itself, and Messiah is definitely not going to contradict himself. And let's see what Isaiah has to say about this in the prophetic end time chapter of 66. I encourage you to go read those last few chapters of Isaiah yourself, and you will see that the whole end of that book is prophetic, talking about the end times, and it caps it off with chapter 66 at the end. So Isaiah chapter 66, the prophetic end time chapter, says in verse 14, "And when you see this, your heart shall rejoice, your bones your bones shall flourish like an herb, and the hand of Yahweh shall be made toward his servants, and his indignation toward his enemies. For behold, Yahweh will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire." We know what time that is. "For by fire and by a sword will Yahweh plead with all flesh, and the slain of Yahweh shall be many. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the garden behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh, and the abomination and the mouse shall be consumed together, says Yahweh." And again, specifically talks about the abomination. "But those who eat swine flesh, and the mouse, and doing the tameh, the unclean things, and the toabah, the sick and disgusting abomination, shall be consumed together, says Yahweh." So the word clearly, just in those few parts, bears out that those unclean foods are still unclean. We want to, in this time coming up, we want to be totally protected, right? From what is going to happen, from the end time events. We want to be that church of Philadelphia that gets delivered. But we can't be that specific group of elect ones if we are partaking in the Toabah. It's still Toabah. It's still sick and disgusting. It's still Tameh. It's still unclean. And here, in the last chapter of Isaiah, there is judgment for those who are still doing that. I'm not saying that a fervent Christian, believer is going to go to hell, but I think how it reads is that they're not going to see that deliverance. They're not going to be spared from everything that's going to start happening. And they will be the ones standing before Messiah in Matthew chapter 7 saying, let us in, let us in. They want to come into New Jerusalem, and Messiah is going to say, depart from me, I never knew you, you who work Torahlessness. That's what that word means, Torahlessness. So not only do we want to be of the kingdom, we want to be in New Jerusalem. Not only do we want to be delivered, we want to be saved, we want to be protected from everything that's going to go down. Especially the really intense stuff we see in Matthew chapter 24. But we need to be learning and applying and walking in the Torah. And a big part of that is for us to cease from those Toabah foods that we like. It's not worth it.